Okay, in this video segment, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at some of the basic features of Hebrew poetry. The reason that we're doing this, of course, is that most of Isaiah, as indeed most of the prophets, are written in poetry. And so, therefore, it's a good idea to have some kind of an idea of what it is we're going to be reading. Okay, because once these patterns become clear to you, I think it will shed additional light on the text, which is what we're trying to do. We need to pay attention, as the church says, to literary genre. Okay, so what is this particular genre we call poetry? Prose we sort of have a grasp on, but what's poetry? What's Hebrew poetry specifically? Because that's what we're going to be reading, albeit in translation. Well, in the first place, Hebrew poetry is succinct. It's terse. In other words, Hebrew poetry, as poetry generally does, figures out ways to say more with fewer words, to do more with less. And a perfect test case, actually, is the book of Judges. In the famous story, which you may know, of the murder of Sisera by Yael in Judges 4, there's the prose version, and in Judges 5 we have the poetry version. They're exactly the same story told in two separate literary genres, and so it's an excellent way between those two chapters of the Bible to compare what poetry is like to what prose is like. And so I would suggest, if you have time, to check those two chapters out and read through them, and you'll kind of get a feel for what we're talking about. Well, it turns out there's a couple verses that we might compare. Here's one specifically that has the terseness I'm talking about. In Judges 4:19, he said to her, okay, this is Sisera to Yael, "Pray give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." Okay, so she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. Okay, now compare this to Judges 5:25. Okay, he asked water. She gave him milk. Stop. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. Okay, you see here that the second one has managed to say the same thing in many that words. Okay, not to mention a nice little rhythm there. Okay, and so you see here that there are two colons in Judges 5:25. Each one is called a stick, and strophe was a term that I introduced last time as well, which is sort of a collection of colons that are related. Okay, so the terseness is one thing that you see poetry can do that prose cannot. Poetry generally is good at using fewer words and never words when it doesn't have to. Okay, what else poetry? Well, poetry is elliptical. Okay, by this I mean sometimes there are words missing. So for instance, let's take a look at Isaiah 45:9. "Woe to him who strives with his maker, an earthen vessel with the potter." Okay, now the first line is fairly straightforward. Woe to him who strives with his maker, who argues back with his maker. Okay, the term strive is actually reeve, which has a notion of contending in the context of a lawsuit or something along those lines. Woe to him who does this. Okay, in other words, woe to the creation who argues back in court to the creator. Okay, an earthen vessel with the potter. Now notice I have strives in parentheses. The strives isn't in the text. Okay, you in effect have to infer that particular word based on the proximity of this line to the previous one. Okay, this is what's called an ellipsis. Okay, once again, it sort of is an extension of the terseness we talked about in the previous slide. Okay, that the poetry, generally speaking, finds ways to use fewer words. And so if the same verb is in mind from one verse to the next, and the writer maybe can't think of a parallel synonymous verb to use, or doesn't want to for whatever reason, oftentimes he'll leave it out completely, as he's done here. Okay, it would be very difficult to have any idea what the B colon of Isaiah 45:9 meant without the first colon to sort of help us. Okay, so bear that in mind, that sometimes the verb is not expressed, and in effect you have to supply it by reading, and that can be a lot of fun when you're reading this in translation, because then you can get one of these cola that is missing a verb and you have no idea what to do with it. Okay, another example would be Isaiah 62:1. Okay, for Zion's sake I will not keep silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not keep rest, until her vindication goes forth as brightness and her salvation as a burning torch. Okay, now notice in the very last line, the first two colons we have verbs expressed. Okay, so no problem. But in the last two colons, there's only a verb expressed explicitly in colon C. Okay, and that's goes forth. Okay, it's not expressed in the second in colon D. Okay, you have to supply it as well for exactly the same reason that it's missing in the first example I gave. Okay, it's just designed to save space. Be aware of that when you're reading. You will find ellipses fairly frequently in Hebrew poetry. Probably more often than in English poetry, in fact. What else about Hebrew poetry? This is really the key feature. Unfortunately, this translates very well into English, and that is the parallelism. Okay, parallelism is really the hallmark of Hebrew poetry. You can't read very far in Hebrew poetry without noticing it. In fact, some of you may have noticed it already without even me having to point it out. But in fact, a lot could be said about it, and we're going to be assuming a certain parallel relationship and using that parallel relationship in trying to make sense of the message of the book of Isaiah throughout the course. And so it's worth spending a little time here on what we're going to be doing with that. Okay, the first and most obvious kind of parallelism is called synonymous parallelism. Okay, and here's an example of synonymous parallelism that's interlinear. In other words, it goes from one colon to the next. Okay, notice here Isaiah 43, a fairly famous verse, a voice cries. That's actually not part of it, but the next two colon have it. Okay, prepare the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Okay, so there's several different kinds of parallel arrangements going from one colon to the next. You see a connection between prepare, okay, on the one hand, and make smooth in the next line. Okay, you see a connection between the way in the one line, okay, and highway in the C colon. Okay, you see in the wilderness, okay, in the B colon, in the desert in the C colon. Okay, two mostly almost exactly the same concepts, different words though. Lord, okay, you have the tetragrammaton there in the B colon, and Eloheinu, okay, we looked at this before, our God in the C colon, okay, which are clearly synonymous as well. Okay, so there's several different kinds of interlinear synonymous parallelism going on there. Okay, Isaiah 41:21 is another example of this. Okay, set forth your case, says the Lord, bring forth your proofs, says the King of Jacob. Now notice, set forth your case on the one hand and bring forth your proofs are two different ways of saying the same thing. This is basically just, legal terminology here. Okay, we're talking about, preparing a legal argument to persuade a judge of something, typically of one's innocence or the guilt of his accusers. Okay, now Lord and King of Jacob, you could say those don't mean the same thing. Well, yes, they kind of do here, in fact. In the second half of Isaiah, the notion of kingship really seems to devolve upon God himself. And several times, God, the Lord, is referred to as the king of Israel. Okay, not surprisingly, because in the context of the second half of Isaiah, the Davidic monarchy's been destroyed. It's been driven into exile, and the Davidic kings have been made eunuchs in the court of the Babylonians. Okay, so here the synonymous relationship between Lord and King of Jacob is appositional. Okay, there are two different ways of saying the same thing within the context of the historical context in which the second half of the book of Isaiah finds itself. Okay, so bear in mind here, you get interpretation from this as well. Lord and King of Jacob would not be things that we automatically would connect. Okay, but in fact we do here, partly because of the parallel arrangement. Okay, let's look at some other kinds of parallelism of synonymous. Okay, this is an intralinear parallel arrangement of synonym. You see Bel, bow down, and Nebo, stoops. Okay, who's Bel, who's Nebo? They're both ancient Near Eastern gods. Bel is one of the Babylonian gods, and Nebo is also one of the Babylonian gods. And the basic idea here is that in the great deliverance that Yahweh is going to perform, the gods of the other nations will be humbled and will ultimately come around to worship the true God of Israel. Bowing down and stooping are the same thing. Bel and Nebo are themselves a parallel arrangement as well, and both of these find themselves within the same line, and so that's why we call it intralinear parallelism, synonymous parallelism, rather than interlinear. Okay, whereas it goes from one colon to the next, this is all within a colon. Okay. These synonymous parallel pairs we see quite often, and you will want to pay attention to these as you read, because you'll notice the same ones cropping up again and again. So much so that many scholars have speculated that there might have been a sort of a master list of which the guild poets who pretty much put together the Bible drew from. Okay, that these parallels continue to crop up in lots of different poetry with different authors. Okay, Jacob, Israel are very frequently put in parallel, especially after the exile. Why? Because you have the notion that Israel really includes all 12 tribes. Okay, and so Jacob and Israel tend to be put in parallel arrangement because Jacob's sort of the patriarch of all of them. You have this idea expressed in many prophets of God pursuing a unification. Okay, justice and righteousness, mishpat, tzedakah in Hebrew. You see these in parallel a lot as well. Probably at least 15 to 20 times in the book of Isaiah you'll find them in parallel. Pay attention to that. Peoples and nations. Okay, amim is the word for peoples. Goyim is the word for nations. Okay, you'll see these a lot as well. Okay, listen and hearken. They go together. Zion and Jerusalem. This is especially common as well after the Babylonian exile. That particular parallel arrangement comes back again because Zion and Jerusalem both take on the role of being the great eternal sort of city of hope, the city of broken dreams and future promise together. Okay, so you'll see a lot of these kinds of parallel pairs all throughout the Isaianic poetry, okay, as you will with the poetry of the other prophets as well that we'll be looking at. Okay, let's look at a different kind of parallelism. This is antithetic parallelism, and this may be obvious what this means. It's like synonymous parallelism is parallelism from one line to the next, in a synonymous or likeness fashion. The antithetical parallelism stresses the opposite function, okay? And like with synonymous parallelism, there's an interlinear and an intralinear as well. Let's look at the interlinear first. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 4. This is again the very famous beginning of the book of consolation. Every valley shall be lifted up, every hill shall be made low, and let the rough ground become a plain, and let the rugged terrain a broad valley. Okay, so in the A colon you see valley, lift up. Okay, there's the basic noun, there's the verb. Okay, in the B colon, however, it's hill, made low. Okay, valley and hills are kind of the opposite land formation. One's flat and low, one's high and rugged. Okay, one will be lifted up, one will be made low. Okay, two opposite functions there. So there's two different kinds of interlinear parallelism, antithetic parallelism going on between the first two colons. Okay, in the C colon, rough ground is becoming a plain, and rugged terrain is becoming a broad valley. Okay, Plain and valley mean roughly the same thing. Rough ground and rugged terrain mean basically the same thing. Okay, but there is a sort of an antithetical parallelism, and actually that's an intralinear arrangement there. Okay, between rough ground and plain and rugged terrain and broad valley. Okay, another example would be Isaiah 55, chapter 55, verses 6 and 7. Okay, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Okay, that's clear enough. That's actually synonymous parallelism there. Seek the Lord, calling upon him seem to mean roughly the same thing. May be found is near. Okay, again, another synonymous idea. Let the wicked forsake his way, and let the unrighteous man his thoughts. Notice there's no forsake there. There's a little ellipsis there on the D colon. But notice that the wicked and unrighteous are put together. Forsake his way, forsake his thoughts, go in the opposite direction, okay, to seeking the Lord and calling upon him. Okay, so there's an antithetical parallelism there between the A and the B on the one hand and the C and the D on the other hand. Okay, so these patterns can work differently, and every verse is a little bit different. Okay, so you're going to see all different kinds of arrangements. Some of them are more elaborate than others. Okay, let's look at a couple others. This is another example of intralinear parallelism. I form light, create darkness. I make weal and create woe. I am the Lord who does all these things. Okay. In this case, light and darkness are the opposites here. Okay. Weal and woe are also opposites, good and bad. All right. God seems to do both of them. All right. So you see again antithetical pairs as well, just as we saw synonymous pairs, and we'll see these in other places in the prophets. Okay. Now, let's look at the third kind of parallelism, which is actually by far the most interesting, and this is what's called synthetic parallelism. Synthetic parallelism. Synthetic parallelism is very difficult to get a grasp on because it really is sort of a catch-all designation for parallel arrangements that aren't quite synonymous, okay, but they're certainly not antithetic. Okay, there's not an opposite relationship, but it's not a synonym either. Okay, and these are very often what you see in the Bible. Let's look at the first one here, Isaiah chapter 47, verse 3. Okay, your nakedness shall be uncovered, your shame shall be seen. Okay, those are probably roughly parallel there, nakedness and shame. Uncovered and seen. That's the first two lines there seem like they're fairly synonymous. Okay, but I will take no vengeance. I will take vengeance. I will spare no man. Okay, now notice the C and the D are kind of synonymous, right? Taking vengeance, sparing no man seem to mean roughly the same thing. But if you notice, spare no man seems to kind of go a little bit beyond the idea of taking vengeance. It sort of spells out in detail what the vengeance is actually going to look like. It seems to, in other words, carry the idea one step further, okay, so that a whole understanding is advanced. It's not just saying the same thing over again in different words. Okay, so from C to D there, in those particular colons, there seems to be a synthetic relationship. Okay, the D colon seems to build on or elaborate on the C colon. Okay, in other words, we could say, C, what's more D? In other words, I'll take vengeance, and what's more, I'll spare nobody. Okay. Likewise, Isaiah 49:3. Okay, sing for joy, O heavens, exalt, O earth. Break forth, O mountains, into spring, for the Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on the afflicted. Now notice in the first line there, the A colon, sing for joy, O heavens, exalt, O earth. Heavens and earth would seem to be opposites in a certain way, but they're really not. Okay? They are what's called a merism or merismus. And you can see the PowerPoint doesn't know my word, and that's why it's underlined it. But a merismus is a poetic feature in which two or more concepts sort of combine to create a whole. Okay, a famous example is from the Mass, when we quote Malachi, From east to west, a perfect offering may be made for the glory of your name. Okay, meaning what? East and west here are not put opposed to each other as two opposite directions, which they actually are on the map, but in fact they are combining forces to in effect create the idea from east to west, that is, from the rising of the sun to the setting. Okay, in other words, all over the world is the idea. Okay, another famous example will be from Psalm 1, where the righteous man studies the law, meditates on it from day to night. Okay, not the day and the night being opposite from each other, one being light, one being darkness. No, it's more the idea of the two combining to create a whole. Okay, a merism. Okay, be on the lookout for that as well. You'll see a lot of this. Okay, and C and D also have a kind of a synthetic relationship. The Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on the afflicted. Okay, this is kind of interesting. There's actually two different tenses here. The has comforted is in the perfect tense in the Hebrew, and will have compassion is in the imperfect tense, which, at least in this, suggests the possibility that the comforting is done already, and the will have compassion will be done in the future. Okay, his people afflicted, not necessarily exactly the same thing, right? It seems as though D kind of carries the idea a little bit further. Comforting people is one thing. Having compassion on the afflicted seems to go even further than that. The afflicted could be more than just his people, and having compassion might be more than just comforting. So you see there, the D colon seems to continue the idea a little bit further. Okay, other examples. Okay, Isaiah 66:1, the A colon. Heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Okay, clearly heaven and earth are not the same thing, and throne and footstool are not the same thing. But you see here that they're both being put together to make a composite whole. Okay, the whole basic idea is that they both work together for the glory of God. That's the idea. The earth is the footstool for God to ascend to his heavenly throne. Okay, but they go together in some sort of a way. But they're not exactly synonymous either, you see. Okay, and they're certainly not antithetic. So you need this third catch-all class, synthetic parallelism, to kind of explain them. Isaiah 56:2 is another example. Blessed is the man who holds it fast. The Son of Man who does this, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, who keeps his hand from doing evil. Well, in the first two colons, the man and Son of Man are synonymous parallelism. In other words, those are two things that you actually see fairly frequently in Hebrew poetry placed in parallel, man and Son of Man. Okay, holds it fast, does this, also seem to mean roughly the same thing. But notice C and D again, you get a little bit of a change. Who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it. So we have a specific idea of Sabbath keeping is obeying the commandments of God, not profaning it. And then we get a more general moral command, who keeps his hand from doing evil. Okay, so you have that notion of keeps and keeps, which obviously is a kind of parallelism, but clearly keeping your hand from doing evil goes much further than just not profaning the Sabbath. Okay, there's a much broader idea that's attendant on doing good, on keeping the law, on behaving in a way that's pleasing to God, on living out one's righteousness. Okay, so again, it's not antithetic, it's not really quite synonymous, so we call it synthetic. Okay, finally, let's look at one more example of this before we go, and this is the famous second servant passage in Isaiah 42. Okay, God says, I am the Lord, Ani Adonai, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand, I have kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring prisoners out of the dungeon, from the prison, those who sit in darkness. Okay, so again, you see here there's almost a kind of an ascent of concepts here. I have called you in righteousness, taking you by the hand, keeping you. Okay, those are all sort of mean the same thing, but keeping you, taking you by the hand seems to put the calling in righteousness a little bit more strongly. All right. In other words, I've called you, what's more I've taken you, what's more I've kept you, okay? What's more I've given you, okay? As a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations. Notice the has given you is not in the D colon is not repeated, so that's another ellipsis. Okay, now here's a question. This is a big interpretive issue. Is covenant to the people synonymous with light to the nations, or is it synthetic? I think it's synthetic. Okay, I don't think people and nations here mean the same thing, and I think we'll have to maybe explain that a little bit more detail, why I think that is when we get there. But it seems to be a two-stage process here. Israel, in other words, the core of holy people who are being addressed here in this particular passage, are the sort of remnant people who are going to be the covenant to the rest of the people. But in turn, that whole renewed people is going to be a light to all the other people on earth. So in other words, there's sort of three stages, three layers of global sanctification that we have envisaged here, I think. Okay, covenant to the people is on one hand, light to the nations is sort of a second stage of that. Okay, stage one, stage two. In other words, there's a synthetic relationship there. And keep in mind also that the opening the eyes to the blind, bringing the prisoners out of the dungeon, these are two different things, related surely, but one goes further than the other. And from the prison, those who sit in darkness. Now, sit in darkness is perhaps another more poetic way of saying blind, but it suggests here also that blindness is really more metaphorical. Okay, the parallelism seems to bring that out. This is a really, really interesting passage, in fact, that we could spend a long time interpreting. But keep in mind, when you do interpret this as you do it, it's necessary to pay attention to the parallelism, because the parallelism really is what sheds light on how different words and different phrases are being employed. Okay, people and nations might well be parallel in other passages, but that doesn't mean that they're parallel in this one. Okay, we would have to sort of take this on a case-by-case basis. Okay, well, great. That's our little spiel on Hebrew poetry. Bear this in mind as we work through Isaiah and the rest of the prophets. Okay, we'll see you.